I'm David. Welcome to the Pigs Fly Observatory. This is part 3 of a series of videos documenting the history and development of my backyard observatory. In this episode, we'll go over the planning and construction of the POD Zenith Table that allows the dome to slide off, exposing the whole sky. Join me on the adventure. The observatory got extensive use throughout those first years of operation. It was wonderful to be up and running in under 10 minutes. I could go out on any clear night and enjoy my journey to space. I appreciated being able to get out often. I was still vexed by having to work around the limitations of not being able to view objects straight up at the zenith. I ordered the POD Zenith Table kit with my Skyshed pod and had gone over the plans for building the PZT many times. I felt the customary approach to a PZT would not be the best solution in my situation. Consequently, I started looking into other options. I found other pod owners who had put together some interesting PZT solutions. From welded frames to custom assemblies, there were many interesting and different alternatives. In the fall of 2014, 2 years after opening, it was my turn to create a custom PZT that would work for my backyard. Like many homes built since the mid-1980s, our backyard is a mere postage stamp with a house on it that's surrounded by trees. The pod is located at a choke point between the deck and the fence, so I needed a PZT that could be disassembled to allow access to the yard. I had to be sure that when the pod dome was on the PZT, it also wouldn't collapse. Finding the balance between strength and portability was essential to my design. Since the pod arrived, our deck needed to be completely resurfaced, and there was enough of the off-cut 1x6 pressure-treated lumber left over for my project. I know I would also need some heavier lumber to support the upper table that the dome would rest on. With pencil and paper, I began sketching out versions of my design. During many nights in the observatory, I gave the PZT design a lot of thought. I recognized that my location presented unique challenges. Right at the heart of the matter was one fundamental concept: unlatch the dome from the walls, push it onto the table that keeps it out of the way during an observing session, then move it back into place afterwards. The standard PZT approach was okay, but I had different ideas of how to go about building mine. The standard approach has a large table made of plywood supported by metal brackets that attach it to the pod. I live in an area that sees a fair amount of snow, and I was concerned about the heavy snow load causing problems. As I considered the design, I concluded there is a benefit from an open frame design that allows most of the snow to fall to the ground. The other benefit from an open frame design is that any remaining snow can be swept or shoveled off with relative ease to keep the PZT clear. Portability had to be incorporated into the design so that if I needed access to the backyard, the PZT could be moved to allow that access. For 2 years, I had thought extensively about how to address the most important basic challenge of building a PZT, allowing unhampered access to the pod door. The dome had to be able to rest on the PZT, and there had to be clearance allowing the door to move freely. This proved to be one of the more challenging aspects to the design. On the one hand, the PZT had to be thin enough to allow for the sweep of the door above and below, and on the other hand, the deck had to be strong enough to support the dome. The gap below the dome and above the top of the door was less than 2 inches. Since I had all this 1x6 wood sitting around, I chose it as the main construction material because wood is easier to work with than metal and lighter too. As I said, the most troublesome design issue was how to accommodate the door. I had an inspired moment late one night in the spring of 2014. While taking a break from chasing galaxies in Markarian's chain, it occurred to me that the 1x6 deck slats could be supported using 2x10 lumber. The slats above and below the door could be cut to fit the outer profile of the dome walls and still allow free movement of the door. The uprights could be made of 2x10s mounted perpendicular to the curve of the outer wall, and the 2x6 pieces used as uprights at the end. I called my PZT design a Trestle Table in that it was a light table with a heavier supporting frame resembling a railway trestle. There were 5 fundamental components in my design: 2 table sections that would support the dome and 3 vertical supports that the table would be placed on. One against the fence at the rear of the pod and another at the front by the door. The third one would project out from the dome to support the middle of the table. Each of the 3 support sections was unique, with the front and back sections sharing a similar mirrored design. With these ideas in mind, I sketched up the design using the measurements that I'd collected. Another trip to the lumber store later, and I had the necessary 2x6 and 2x10 boards to build the upright sections, as well as some 2x3 boards to help stiffen the frames. Before starting the construction process, I finally opened the PZT kit box for the quick release brackets. The standard dome brackets were swapped out for the quick release version. Since the quick release brackets were the only thing needed from the kit, the standard brackets and the rest of the PZT parts were boxed up and stowed back in the corner of the garage again. With that task completed, I moved on to building the PZT uprights. For the sake of clarity, I wasn't working from a full set of plans or blueprints or anything. Like most of my woodworking projects, this would be a custom job where the final dimensions for cutting the boards are determined as they're being cut. After a few laps of the pod with pencil, paper, and tape measure, I felt sure my thumbnail plan corresponded to the actual dimensions. A few cups of coffee and several sheets of paper later, the plan was ready to go. It said that the most accurate measure is a fair line, and that's what I was intending. The center support of the PZT was the first piece to be constructed. During the design phase, I decided that this section would be secured to the pod using a turnbuckle with snap shackles and eye bolts. This contraption was used to draw the middle support and the pod together. It was an uncomplicated element of the construction and turned out to be the easiest to assemble. After cutting the boards to measure, I assembled them using deck screws and glue. The top 2x6 had a 2x3 board mounted underneath and was longer than the bottom board to accommodate the travel of the dome. The outside and middle upright sections were notched to accommodate the 2x3 stiffener on the underside. The 2x6 upright section next to the dome had a hole drilled through it that allowed access to the eye bolt attaching it to the pod. Gusset blocks were added to the corners so the finished sections would resist racking and twisting. After assembly, it was fit into place with the snap shackles and turnbuckle. Now I turned my attention to the front support that would surround the door. One of my nocturnal design considerations was about how to address the front and back supports using the 1x6 boards. The outside sections would be doing double duty in that they would be supporting the dome. They would also need to keep the dome from springing outward. The quickest solution was to use some aluminum angle sections to hold the dome in at the edges. But how tall should they be was a factor to be considered. After another reconnoitering trip to the building supply store, I quickly concluded that the 1" by 1" by 60" long aluminum angles would work perfectly. They appeared to be long enough to contain the travel distance that the pod would cover, and I rightly concluded the sideways pressure of the unmounted dome wouldn't cause it to jump over the sides. It was apparent from the outset that the topmost of the front and rear sections mirrored each other, with one main difference though: the symmetry of the back section against the fence was interrupted where the bump out interfered with the position of the board at the deck level. Taking this factor into account, I thought it easiest to treat them as having mirrored symmetry until the final fitting. The 2x10 uprights were positioned so they would be perpendicular to the outer walls of the pod. This worked well because the eye bolts used to hold down the tarp at the midsection of the pod walls could also be used to fasten the PZT structures to the pod. With these considerations in mind, I got busy with the tools and wood and had the front section assembled and fitted before long. I'd been assembling the back support in parallel with the front section, so it was mostly ready to go by the time the front section was completed. Some minor adjustments later, and both sections were ready to be installed. After screwing the aluminum bumpers onto the two sections, I pressed my neighbor into service again, helping to lift the rear section into place against the fence. I used blind nuts at the height of the eye bolts so that a bolt with a large washer could be passed through to secure the upright to the walls. Shortly, I stood back and looked at my handiwork. The upright sections were in place and ready for the deck. The open construction of the upper deck sections was an advantage. The outside boards of the two sections were intended to rest on the outer upright supports as well as at the center section. 2x3 and 1x6 boards were used for their construction. The two table sections appear symmetrical but are unique in how they accommodate the geometry of the pod bump-out bay at the fence. The construction took a couple of hours to complete. Despite their asymmetrical construction, I believe that they adhere to the maxim, the best measure is a fair line. With the upper deck sections assembled, it was time to put the finishing touches on the PZT. Throughout construction, the fitting process ensured that the as-built sections would fit together suitably and securely. One of the finishing pieces that had to be in place was a stop at the end of the table to ensure that the dome would not slide off for a short trip to the ground. I built a locking mechanism to secure the table sections to the uprights by drilling a hole through the end of the center upright, and then I built a box out of the off-cut wood. An old rake handle was used as a locking pin to hold the box in place. That box acts as a stop when the dome is pushed off onto the PZT. Finally, a brace was added to keep the outside frames from spreading when the dome was pushed onto the table. It was all done. The front and rear sections were attached using the bolts that go through the eye bolts in the pod walls. They were all captured by a blind nut on the opposite side of the 2x10 upright. The center section was tensioned and everything felt ready. I could not resist. I had to get up on the PZT and do a bit of a walk around. A few hops and kneels later and I concluded it to be sturdy and steady. Hopping down, I went inside the sky shed and pushed back the dome. For the first time, a sight to behold. The whole sky was up there. Sky, houses, trees, lots of trees. Looking straight up to the zenith, I saw the advantage I'd deferred for so long. Now I had the whole sky at my disposal, all night long. This marked a new chapter at the observatory where astrophotography finally came into its own. Looking back at the 2014 PZT and the 2023 version, there aren't a lot of changes. The wood has grayed over time, there are a few rusty screws holding down the 1x1 aluminum bumper rails. I've gone through a few sets of shock cords that hold the tarp down. The upright sections are still straight and true, but the table sections have cupped a bit over time. It all still works as designed, so that's the best thing. It appears that the Sky Shed pod and PZT have settled together on the patio that they rest on. After 8 years of no maintenance and a couple of years being stored during an interruption in the observatory activities, the sections are still remarkably firm. No signs of twisting or racking in any of those sections. I'm happy with the design. All the planning during those nights in the observatory came down to a few key milestones for success. The PZT had to be able to hold the dome securely. It had to be light and modular, i.e. easy to move around. It had to be strong enough and stable enough to handle the elements in my location. The PZT had to manage snow load and be easy to clear of snow. In my opinion, this PZT design has exceeded its requirements. I'm looking forward to many more years of having access to my whole sky. Thanks for watching. See you next time. concludes the video series about my backyard observatory story. I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed following along with the tale. I didn't try to make this a how-to video on constructing a personal observatory. Rather, I tried to express the experience of realizing a long-held dream of having an astronomical observatory. There are times when I can hardly wait to get out to the observatory, and there have been times when I made up a million reasons not to. The advantage in having a personal observatory at my disposal is that when the mood strikes, it only takes about 10 minutes to be up and running and about 10 minutes to close. Thanks for watching this episode. Please like and share if you found this video interesting, and we'll see you at the observatory the next time.